The United States generally has never wanted to have a headache in the Persian Gulf. These are pretty wealthy countries that should be able to take care of their affairs a little bit better. I believe that even under the Trump administration, that is what President Trump wanted. I never believed for a moment that he was going to go to war with Iran. And that is indeed what happened. He avoided war. He just he had a different way of speaking about things, let's put it that way. So I think the United States is not headed in the direction of outright conflict. But that remains to be seen depending on where the nuclear negotiations go. If those negotiations fail, obviously we can expect heightened tensions in the Gulf region.
Hello, World Boston. Since 2018, when the United States exited the JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, an agreement that reduced Iran's supplies of enriched uranium in return for lifting sanctions, there has been a lot of debate about what will happen if Iran creates a nuclear weapon and how to prevent that from happening. But what we might forget is that the JCPOA actually still stands despite noncompliance from the US and Iran. So in fact, this Monday, as many of you probably noticed, the remaining parties to the agreement, Iran, Britain, China, France, Germany, and Russia, met in Vienna to attempt to revive the deal. Notably, the US is not attending the talks, but is getting information from allies while staying at a nearby hotel. There's literally shuttling going on back and forth. The results of these negotiations could have significant impacts on the power dynamic of the Persian Gulf and may change the tides in the fraught relationship between Iran and its greatest regional rival, Saudi Arabia. So how did the two countries get to this point in their relationship? And where do they go from here? And what role, if any, should the US play moving forward? What are our interests in the region these days? So we'll address these questions and more in tonight's Great Decisions program, The Future of Persian Gulf Security. I'm Mary Eintema, the president and CEO of World Boston. Welcome to the program. And now, at last, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Banafsheh Keynoush. For the sake of time, I will abbreviate Dr. Keynoush's biography, but you can read it on our website. Dr. Banafsheh Keynoush is a scholar of international affairs. An academic for over 13 years, she has conducted field work in the Middle East for 2 decades, including in Saudi Arabia and Iran. She was a visiting scholar at Princeton University and a visiting fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh. She is the author of Saudi Arabia and Iran, Friends or Foes, and the editor of Iran's Interregional Dynamics in the Near East. And we were just talking, we have a hometown connection. She's a graduate of the Fletcher School. Dr. Keynoush is president of the geopolitical consulting firm Mideast Analysts, a fellow at the International Institute for Iranian Studies, a team member at the Carnegie-funded Sectarianism, Proxies, and Desectarianization Project, and co-chair of the Middle East Forum at the Commonwealth Club of California. In addition to her career in academia, her professional experience includes advisory, public affairs, and analytical work for government agencies, international organizations, policy centers, and private companies. Banafsheh, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Go right ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Mary, for having me and your team. Also, thank you. It's really a great honor to be hosted by World Boston. And just the name Boston, as you mentioned, is homecoming to me. It's where I spend one of the most important formative times of my life, building great friendships, and it's an absolute honor to rejoin you through that connection. Now, if you allow me, I want to welcome everyone to this program and thank you for joining us as well, and then dive into the presentation. I have a couple of slides to show, so I will be going back and forth between these slides, and we'll take it from here. So, as you know, I've been asked by World Boston, by its Great Decision Series, to say a few words about the future of Persian Gulf security. And when I received the title for this presentation, I went, well, that is quite a tall order. And for some of the reasons that Mary actually explained. So I thought I'll begin with a few basics of where the Persian Gulf is. It has a number of littoral states, as we know, that have been listed here on the slide, as well as a couple of neighboring countries that constitute the wider Middle East region, such as Turkey, Israel, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Yemen. The littoral states itself includes primarily Iran, Iraq, and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the 6 Arab states that border the Persian Gulf, or as they wish to call it, sometimes the Arabian Gulf or just the Gulf. And there are a number of external actors that have very key interests in the Persian Gulf waterway. The United States of America above all, followed by Russia, China, the UK, and others. And by others, I mean, of course, a number of other European powers, as well as Asian powers, Asian countries, but increasingly many other countries that are not necessarily world powers, but countries that are interested in this area because of the important trade routes that it provides. As you can see on this globe map, which is from one of my own globes that I own, the trade routes are very vital from the tip of the Persian Gulf between the United Arab Emirates and Oman. You can practically cross through Iran, reach the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus, into Central Asia, etc., as well as routes that take you via Turkey to Europe, not to mention the routes that go to the south, to the Gulf of Aden and through the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandab to the Red Sea and Africa, and the Suez Canal. So it's a very vital waterway, needless to say. Now, who are the main actors in the Persian Gulf? I have used some colonial era words here that traditionally categorize the countries of the Persian Gulf region. We don't need to subscribe to these colonial era words like core Arab states or periphery non-Arab states, but they do resonate with us today because they have geopolitical ramifications. So if you don't mind, I'll continue using these words. The core Arab states include, of course, the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council that was formed around 1981, consolidated by 1982. And between Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain, plus Iraq, which is not a member of the GCC, but another Arab state of the Persian Gulf region. The periphery states of the region include primarily only one, which is Iran, but the periphery non-Arab states of the Middle East include Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And I mentioned Turkey and Israel because their interactions with Iran and with the GCC are vital to the future of the stability of the Persian Gulf region. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. There are key external actors, the United States being the primary one as the major security guarantor for the region for decades, practically since after World War II, and more so through its partnership with the GCC countries. And then there are other key external actors with vital economic and security interests, primarily Russia, China, and Europe. Europe to the extent that it sees a stable Persian Gulf from a trade angle, but from a security perspective, European interests are often overshadowed by US interests in the Persian Gulf region. I want to say a few words just about the core and periphery before I move to the next slide. One thing that we must recognize about the periphery non-Arab states is that them being non-Arab, they have a vital unspoken interest among them, which is not to be contained by the core Arab states. Now, there's a fair amount of tension between Iran, Turkey, and Israel. I'll speak about that, but no matter how difficult those tensions are, It is vital that neither of these three countries becomes too weak in a manner that would then enable the core Arab states to gain the upper hand from a security perspective over the periphery in a collective fashion. That may sound a little complicated, but there's nothing simple about the Persian Gulf region. As this next slide shows, there are important regional power dynamics in the Persian Gulf. The core periphery conflicts and tensions include a couple. The Saudi Arabian-Iranian rivalry, which is ongoing. I can say a few words about that. It is a symptom of power imbalances in the Persian Gulf, often exacerbated by foreign power actions in the region. So whenever, as an external foreign power, the United States has stepped in, or prior to that, the British, or any other foreign power, but here we're primarily talking about the United States, in a manner that tips the balance of power too much in favor of one country or versus the other, Saudi Arabia versus Iran, then there is a fair amount of power imbalance that begins to destabilize the region. And since the United States continues to be a major player in the Persian Gulf, this rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is an ongoing symptom of what the United States policies aim to do in the region, which is what I will be specifically speaking about more tonight. There is the Arab-Israeli wars between the core and periphery. As we know, history tells us that there have been 4 wars at least in the 20th century. There was the Iran-Iraq War in 1980-1988, and there are some tensions between Saudi Arabia and Turkey, UAE and Turkey, especially since an attempted coup in Turkey in 2016. They are trying to address those tensions and revive a better relationship at the moment. There are also core conflicts and tensions. As we know, the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had some tensions with Qatar. In 2017, they even placed a blockade on Qatar over certain differences, including Qatar's decision to somehow engage with Iran more than the rest of the GCC countries. And there are a number of others that I've listed here, but it doesn't end there. There's also periphery conflicts, one being between Israel and Iran. I'll talk more about that later. And ongoing low-level intensity conflicts between Turkey and Israel and Turkey and Iran. Now, I was asked to also talk about the historical influences that have led to the current power dynamics in the Persian Gulf. And as you can see, I've listed them. Since the 1970s, the US tried to build some balance of power between Saudi Arabia and Iran through the Nixon Doctrine and its extended twin pillars policy, enabling these 2 regional countries to take more charge of the security of the region. That ended with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. But even when the twin pillars policy was operating, Saudi Arabia had some oil differences with the United States when the Arab-Israeli war began, and that led to some oil wars in 1973. Then later on, before the Iranian Revolution, Iran had some issues with the United States over the pricing of oil. Iran wanted higher prices. The United States needed lower oil prices. Anyhow, long story short, the Iranian Revolution ended all of that. There was a US embassy takeover in Iran, a hostage crisis, and the release of the American hostages in Iran after 444 days of intensive negotiations between the United States and Iran through the mediation of Algeria and some other regional countries. But ultimately, because we had this bitter experience with Iran, the power imbalances in the region could exacerbate it. The United States stopped having relations with Iran, and therefore its relations with the GCC countries and with Saudi Arabia consolidated until the nuclear deal that Mary mentioned in 2015, and the US pull out of the deal in 2018 under the Trump administration, and now we are where we are, trying to see whether we can revive the JCPOA. Where is the US role here? The US has been a guarantor of Gulf security, but I would say that its foreign policy has shifted between industriousness, being very proactive in asserting US leadership role with partners such as the GCC, but also with countries like Iraq and with Turkey and with Israel and others in the Middle East. But then it has also shifted towards foreign policy inertia towards Iran because of the lack of relationship with Tehran and Iran's relatively independent foreign policy agenda vis-a-vis the United States in trying to just carve out a different foreign policy path of its own, independent of US foreign policy preferences, as we know. Now, because this is a source of conflict and tension in the Persian Gulf, I need to say a few words about the theories that dominate our understanding of US-Iranian ties. The obvious theory is which we are all conscious of, is the containment one. The US decision to contain Iran through either nuclear containment, preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear power, security containment, controlling Iran's influence in the Middle East, but elsewhere and beyond the region as well, and military containment through the control, for example, of Iran's ballistic missile program. But there are other theories, in my humble view, that have subconsciously dominated Washington's behavior toward Iran, which has not always served Washington. One is game theory, which, as you know, many of us know, it comes from the Cold War. It's really ancient in some respects, historically speaking, if we want to try to apply it to Iran today in the context of the Persian Gulf, to assume that somehow we can model our strategic interactions with Iran in order to produce an optimal decision-making process and engagement with Iran. It may or may not always work. The example of the JCPOA told us that it worked temporarily, led to a nuclear deal, but it broke down. And even in the course of negotiations that led to the JCPOA, Iran and the United States were trying to kind of predict each other's actions here and there, especially the United States trying to predict Iran's behavior step by step, which doesn't always apply to an actor like Iran. And I'll explain why later. But we have also fallen back on what we have in mathematics termed as chaos theory, in the fact that oftentimes, as the United States, when we fail to predict Iran's behavior, when we fail to understand, for example, why it just won't work with the United States over the JCPOA as of the time that we're speaking tonight, then we fall back on facing some unpredictabilities in our relationship with Iran, which would cause more chaos in the ties between the United States and Iran. Now, what does that say in terms of the order that we want to have in the Persian Gulf? The current US-led regional order, and by order in IR, we mean the ability, for example, by the United States to work with certain regional entities, in this case, the number of countries that constitute the Persian Gulf region. The problem with this order that we have now is that even now, the United States doesn't always get along with all the GCC countries at all times. For example, there are tensions in US-Saudi relations at any given point of time. It doesn't dominate the relationship, but it definitely creates an undercurrent of unease that pushes Saudi Arabia into an Eastern pivot, into making more deals with countries like Russia or China, as other GCC states as well. But also, we're not always equipped in this current regional order to deal with countries that like Iran, which I argue have unlimited aspirations, limitless security aspirations. And why is that difficult? Because we cannot really predict the future order of the Persian Gulf. There are academics and scholars that argue that, well, that future may involve more of China, more of an Asia pivot. True, but an order conceptually means thinking of a region as geographic entities and not just as trade entities. And if we look at the Persian Gulf, we really can't predict where the current tensions will lead us in terms of a future order. Again, because we are dealing with countries with unlimited aspirations, such as Iran, but we also have conflict-prone countries like Iraq, Now, I'll halt there to move to the next slide, which is the current state of Persian Gulf security. As we know, the United States is trying to have an over-the-horizon presence here and in the Persian Gulf region. And I'll say a little bit about that very quickly. You know, we do want to provide nuclear protection guarantees to countries like Israel, the GCC countries. We do want to provide security guarantees. We do want to coordinate our security with those partners in the Persian Gulf region. Sometimes we engage in security posturing as well to put everybody at ease. For example, as we know, in early 2020, under the Trump administration, Qasem Soleimani, who was an Iranian Quds Force commander, a paramilitary group associated with Iran's Revolutionary Guards, was killed in Iraq by the United States. Well, that's all I can say about over the horizon security guarantees for the Persian Gulf. It can only go so far. And I want to switch back to the slide and share this screen with you again to show that basically, as you can see, it leads to prevailing power imbalances and insecurity as we see manifested in the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, in the Israeli-Iranian security rivalry, and in a host of other unresolved regional conflicts. So I was asked again by my host tonight to address this question. Given that Iran is difficult to deal with, is military force a viable foreign policy in 2021 and beyond for the United States? Well, the nuanced answer is maybe not, because if you look at core, periphery, periphery, and the preferences of external power dynamics, more or less, none of them seek war. And I have to say that we have to take our hats off to the Persian Gulf region and its actors and players, because despite the tensions, prevailing tensions here in the region, this speaks of a certain level of predictable stability that remains in the region. And that is because the regional countries are pretty wealthy and therefore capable of upholding their security. And so despite the tensions in the Persian Gulf, I would argue that it is still a pretty stable unit, a pretty stable region. But then there's a simple answer, which is yes, the United States can always go to war. There is, first of all, nothing in the international system that prevents wars. That's why we have wars all the time throughout history. But then if there's no other alternative, obviously, to say containing Iran, then war is obviously an alternative. But I always say, in thinking about that alternative, what is the final goal for the United States? Is it breaking up Iran into smaller geographic units, for example, in order to build another order in the Persian Gulf that the United States can then manage better? Is it reconceptualizing the whole concept of the Gulf region, and what will that mean for other countries like Saudi Arabia? Or basically, will that lead to chaos? We don't know. And so if only going to wars obviously was that simple, and I won't delve too much on this slide, but basically it's complicated, as the examples of Iraq and Afghanistan showed. But there are new theaters to project Gulf power. The Gulf countries are all now projecting power in, say, the African continent, in the Red Sea. The United States has rolled its sleeves up and tried to be more assertive in this region, which it usually had a more hands-off approach toward. And that means that it's complicated. Going into war in the Persian Gulf will complicate all our power calculations pretty much across the globe. But for example, as I show here, in Africa. And what is the alternative to war? Well, there are a bunch of alternatives. We can weaken Iran as an adversary. We can have a deal with Iran. We can have an impermanent deal, or a combination of all. I'm running out of time. I'll be very quick here. But I do want to say a few words here. So where do we head? What is the future of the Persian Gulf? Are we looking at a new Gulf regional order, or an order that really doesn't really properly exist at all? Obviously, if we want to redefine order, we have to look at our adversaries and our partners' material power as well as their ideational power. Materially, all these countries in the Persian Gulf are pretty wealthy countries. So they're fine. Ideationally, there's some troubles, including with Iran's ideological influences, foreign policy influences. So it's tricky. It's tricky to deal with ideational power. And that is why the United States contains Iran's material power through sanctions, etc., in the hope that it can also contain that ideational power. The other scenario is to say that we'll have a Persian Gulf in the future that really doesn't benefit from a proper order scenario, because there are countries like Iran that have limitless security aspirations. And so in that case, what do we do as the United States? Do we ride the waves of change along with Iran and many other actors in the Persian Gulf and say, come what may? And do we accept our limits as the United States, the limits of US power? I would say that, here is the trickiest part of our foreign policy challenge toward the Persian Gulf. If we ride the waves of change, then that is fine, because we will be one of many actors, and we might find avenues of corresponding with Iran. But we will also need to find ways of limiting the policy influences in Washington that work against ourselves at times in dealing with the Persian Gulf. I can talk more about that in the Q&A. But essentially, we need to understand where the actors in the Persian Gulf are going. A limitless aspiring player like Iran ultimately sees the Persian Gulf as a vehicle toward expediting the end of the world. And what does that mean? That's what a lot of American evangelicals also speak about, except that for the evangelicals, they want the return of Israel's borders to its historic borders to expedite the end of the world. The Iranians want, the hardliners especially, want the United States within Israel, protecting Israel, to then fight both Israel and the United States in that final outcome. But if the United States, and I know this sounds very non-theoretical, but believe me, there's a lot of discussions about this in Iran's policy circles. But if the United States decides to ride the waves and doesn't need to always be hostile toward Iran, and then maybe when, say, for those who believe in the end of the world, powers might unite or confront each other, but maybe there'll be less tensions, less costly wars, and maybe there won't be an end of the world as far as I'm concerned, and we'll have a more peaceful Persian Gulf. But as I say, it requires a certain level of humility in Washington to accept and admit the limits of US power. With that said, we have the option now to define the future of the Gulf, either through cooperation or through confrontation. And I've said enough about that. So thank you, World Boston. Thank you very much. And I look forward to receiving your questions.
Thank you so much, Banafsheh. What a fantastic summary of very complicated set of questions and dynamics. To complicate things a little more, I wonder if you could speak about what I think is really an enormous shift represented by the Abraham Accords, and what that's doing to this very complex ecosystem that you just described.
That's a great question. Thank you, Mary, for it. So from a people's to people's perspective, it's good. It's good if people can make peace. There are projects that I myself have helped, facilitate in the form of conversations that aim to bring the people of the Gulf region, especially the Arabs, closer to Israel. Why not? As you know, Iranians and Israelis were close. We have a very important Jewish community in Iran. But right now, there's no people-to-people connection, but I can tell you a lot of people in Iran wouldn't mind that connection. But then there's the security angle of it. And from a security perspective, it's very complicated. Iran understands that the United States needs to support Israel in the end game. And it's important for Iran to have a conversation with the United States in order to make sure that Israel does not contain Iran on its own. Israel if I make sense. So the Abraham Accords does present a challenge because Israel comes closer to Iran's borders through strategic partnerships, say, with the United Arab Emirates. Right now, they're engaging in a lot of security discussions, for example, to expand maritime cooperation between Israel and the UAE in the Persian Gulf waters. Well, that's very threatening to Iran. Things are also tightening in Iran's northern borders, from a security angle. The United States is also working with Iran's northern neighbors to contain Iran more. That is why Iran is at the negotiating table right now in Vienna, to maintain that ongoing dialogue with the United States in order to make sure that the Abrahamic Accords do not lead to an eventual full containment of Iran, which is the direction that things might go. So I hope that partly answers the question.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now we are going to take a question from Gota. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for the initial introduction and sharing your views. My question is two-part. One is, based on all of this, what are the current U.S. interests in the region that we should be interested to know about as professionals working in the international security region area? The other thing is what form of democracy, because we know that Western form of democracy and ideology is not suitable for all regions and countries. What form of public power or people power do you see Iran wanting, and what is it that we can do to sort of help promote those principles more with Washington or as civil society?
Great, two very meaty questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I think that right now we don't want conflict. We cannot really afford a major war. No one can. And we want to figure things out in a manner that Iran does not stay a headache for the United States. The United States generally has never wanted to have a headache in the Persian Gulf. These are pretty wealthy countries that should be able to take care of their affairs a little bit better. I believe that even under the Trump administration, that is what President Trump wanted. I never believed for a moment that he was going to go to war with Iran. And that is indeed what happened. He avoided war. He just he had a different way of speaking about things, let's put it that way. So I think the United States is not headed in the direction of outright conflict. But that remains to be seen depending on where the nuclear negotiations go. If those negotiations fail, obviously we can expect heightened tensions in the Gulf region, correct? Now, in terms of democracy, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because oftentimes the United States moves into the region to advance its policy by promoting democracy and democratic values when it is unable to have another form of dialogue with the regional countries, such as Iran. So democracy in Iran is an important component of US foreign policy toward Iran. But the Iranians have turned the concept of democracy on its head, the Iranian government claiming that, well, who's to define democracy? That is just the Western democracy. We have our ideas of democracy, and they try to, play with the concept of democracy. So I think that democracy is a very important concept if we allow it to grow, as you said, at the level of civil society. Because fundamentally, human beings are born to be free. And that's when the most meaningful dialogue can happen. And if somehow trade can be expanded in the region, despite these tensions, there's a lot of trade that is going on, even with Iran. I think the United States has given a tiny bit of green light here and there for some trade to happen with Iran too. Trade can also become a facilitator of that human contact. So I think if we are wise, we can expect a brighter future if we are wise.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, now we're going to go to our friend John Ballantyne. Hi, John. Go right ahead.
Very well. You probably know my colleague, Nader Habibi, and he has done some, I would like to sort of ask about the Belt and Road Initiative, and I forget the name of the port that's being built in Pakistan, which would then take Iranian gas and everything else there and sort of kind of put that in an agent-based kind of framework of the role of the Belt and Road and the relationships of China in the Middle East. I think that's a significant change. And as you know, there's a little bit of problem of completing that project in Pakistan. But nonetheless, that's a significant change in sort of the shifting flows of energy.
Yes. Yes. Would you like me to say a few words, some comments about this? It is a very important component of how we look at the future of the Persian Gulf, because the Chinese and also the Russians will be stepping in soon in terms of expanding these trade deals, these port deals. And you might be interested to know that it's not just Iran engaging in these port deals with other world powers other than the United States. So are our traditional allies in the Persian Gulf. The UAE, for example, Oman, for example, are more interested in working with China in expanding the Persian Gulf's port capacity. There's a lot of great promise within the region from a trade angle. Now, some might argue that, well, it's not ideal for China to take over the whole region. I don't think that's exactly happening. These countries have a lot of wealth independent of China, and I think they are smart enough to get what they can out of this policy of outreach toward Asia. In the case of Iran, being under sanctions, obviously, it has to be more lenient with Chinese terms of expansion. So I think, we can dismiss trade. Right now in Vienna, during the nuclear talks, China has been stepping in and trying to protect its economic interests in the Persian Gulf, because it's very vital for China and also for Russia that somehow this deal does not cause a new problem for the region. They need to secure their investments, and the United States needs to listen to them. And I think they all understand that. The Biden administration, above all, understands that.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll go to Jim Kaufman, World Boston board member. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Mary. And Dr. Keynoush, thank you for joining World Boston. Much appreciated. So I've got one small question and one larger question. The small one is, you left Egypt out of your description of peripheral characters. And in particular, if Iran continues to pursue a nuclear weapon, I have to imagine that Egypt then feels threatened. But my bigger question is, you characterized Iran's perception of Israel as more of a threat given the peace agreement that Mary mentioned, the Abraham Accords, that Israel is now involved in trade with the Gulf states and in essence, normalized relations. It's baffling to me, given that Iran is funding Hezbollah, arming Hamas. Israel's under constant attack from material supplied by Iran. Iran has forces in Syria. They're right on Israel's border. Yet you described the perception from the Iranian standpoint as Israel being a threat to it due to its peace agreements with Arab states. Can you clarify that for me? I just don't get that.
Yes. So because we're speaking about the Persian Gulf and Iran's threat perceptions as a central country and power in the Persian Gulf, then I was speaking about how Iran perceives its threats, whether real or actual. And the Abraham Accords is something that Iran is extremely sensitive about, because if Israel does engage in wider security cooperation with the GCC countries, then obviously Iran has to watch out a little more, right? This doesn't take away from the fact that Iran is expanding its own power and influence and projecting it across the Middle East on Israel's borders and posing a very important threat to Israel. This doesn't take away from the fact that Iran's nuclear program is a very important threat, as you mentioned, not just to Israel, but also to countries like Egypt. So I hope that I wasn't unclear about this or fuzzy about this. But I think if we are to examine Israeli-Iranian relationships, theoretically speaking, we have to put it into two boxes. One is the issue of nuclearization, Iran's nuclearization. Any nuclear country, in the Persian Gulf region will pose a threat to Israel. Israel will have a problem whether Iran becomes a nuclear weapon capable country or Saudi Arabia or the any of them, because it's a problem. But if you take the nuclear factor out and you look at the region from the angle of Israel, Turkey, and Iran, it's not as vital an issue for them to get into war with one another over another subject other than the nuclear issue. Because they're still distant neighbors and they are the periphery and they have a host of other issues to deal with. And since Iran's revolution in 1979, it's been almost 42 years, Israel and Iran have not gone into a direct conflict, despite the many threats that they feel from each other. So that tells us something about the flexibility of the region in accepting some security shocks without going into war. I don't know how much sense I make, but I'll just summarize it. Israel and Egypt do not need to be in a direct conflict with Iran if Iran does not become a nuclear weapons power right away. That doesn't mean they don't have other problems, but they feel they can do that by containing Iran. Egypt, I didn't mention Egypt because Egypt is an Arab country that does not belong to the Persian Gulf, and it's a traditional power, but I think Egypt will have a more vital role to play in terms of the Red Sea politics. And I'll be happy to say more about that. But since we're talking about the Persian Gulf, I'll just leave it at that.
I appreciate your response. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Great. So let's go to Raoul now. Hi, Raoul. Go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you very much. My question deals with the relationship between Iraq and Iran. And if you could project ahead a few years, what do you believe the prospects are for more collaboration and less conflict than exists now, particularly between Shia and Sunni in Iraq as a consequence of some of the activity of Iran? And is the U.S. helping or not?
In the second work that I edited, Iran's Interregional Dynamics in the Near East, we had contributions by authors trying to understand how much influence Iran actually has in countries like Iraq. And the answer is that Iran's influence is actually not to be taken for granted. You know, often we say Iran has influence, but that's not always the case. Iran's influence is actually receding at times because the Iraqis are national players. And Iraq's recent parliament elections showed that groups that were closer to Iran were unable to have a majority of seats, win a majority of seats in Iraq. So we cannot just readily assume that Iran has unhindered influence over Iraq. But what Iran has is a fair amount of security influence in Iraq. And this is not just something new. If you look at the history of Iran and Iraq, even when Iraq was part of the Ottoman Empire, there were dozens of conflicts between Iraqis and Iranians, Persians at the time. And some of them involved Iran's desire to gain control over the Iraqi Shia holy cities. So that will never go away. Annually, Iran sends up to 1 million to 2 million pilgrims to visit those shrines in Iraq. Iran ideally would like to see a stable Iraq in which Shias and Sunnis live fairly comfortably side by side and politically, but in which no party or no grouping is strong enough to challenge Iran. Because Iran had many wars with Iraq, and seeing a weaker Iraq is more reassuring to Tehran in that respect. So with that said, long story short, Iran will continue to exert its security influence over Iraq whenever and however it can, but the Iraqis will pursue their own national interests and the Iranians theirs in that process. And I hope this makes some sense.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we'll go to Madi, please. Hi.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Keynoush, for this presentation. It was great. I wanted to ask you about the Iranian presence in Syria and the power dynamics or the play that it is playing with Russia. There has been some theories about Iran wanting access to the Mediterranean. I think the Syrian coastal cities or the main ports in Syria are directly under Russian stewardship in a way. And I don't know what potential Lebanon has. And on the other hand, I think Russia has been allowing Israel to strike Iranian targets in Syria largely. So there is this sort of I don't know how to describe this, but maybe a conflict of interest between Russia and Iran in Syria. So maybe you can comment on that and what is the long-term goals of Iran being in Syria? And maybe is that going to materialize with Russia being there? Thank you.
The long-term goal of Iran in Syria is what I explained toward the end of my comment. Syria is a vital location for the end of the world from the prism of Iran's religious leaders. Many believe that the end of the world will happen on the borders between Syria and Israel. So in order to expedite the end of the world, you can imagine that the Iranian forces will always remain interested in Syria geographically speaking, as a territory. But strategically, from a geopolitical standpoint, while Iran and Russia have conflicting interests, there are two factors at play in Syria. One is that Russia does not enjoy overwhelming power in Syria or over Iran in specific. It has a lot of influence, but it does not necessarily have enough influence to be able to rein in Iran's ideational power. Remember when I spoke about material power versus it might be able to control Iran's material power in Syria, for example, by vying for contracts in Syria or whatever else it is militarily that it can do to contain the operation of Iran's forces in Syria. But ideationally, it does not possess enough control. Then steps in Syria. Syria itself is a sovereign state. And again, in our recent edited volume, Syria was another case example that we looked into. And we came up with the same conclusion as we did with Iraq, that we cannot assume that Iran has unhindered influence and access in Syria either, because Syria is a sovereign actor, just like Iraq is. And it, in the end of the day, must pursue Syrian interests. And Syrian interests, for example, right now are bringing it closer into the Arab fold a little bit. The same dynamics more or less in Lebanon. So I don't think that Iran has a problem working with these dynamics as long as Iran's own material and security interests are met. Materially, Iran needs sanctions lifted. Security, it needs to know that nobody's going to attack it. But if those interests are not met, if a nuclear deal or any deal with Iran is not to be had, then we can not assume an Iraq or a Syria that would be free of Iranian influence, no matter how much the United States might or might not do in Iraq or Russia might or might not do in Syria, because the ideational aspect of Iranian power is not easily controllable.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So now we'll come back home to our own team here at World Boston. I think Shannon has a question for you.
Hello, Dr. Keynoush. Thank you so much for being here tonight and for your presentation. You spoke a lot about state actors, and I was hoping you could touch a little bit on non-state actors, specifically intergovernmental organizations, and the role they play in the region. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, I'll talk about intergovernmental organizations. There's a very vibrant civil society. For example, in Iran, that might come across as a surprise to many observers, but very vital, very dynamic, very independent, very, very promising civil society. And it is flourishing in the Arab world. Iran has a longer history of civil society engagement, but it's flourishing across the region. Unfortunately, because of security concerns, oftentimes the activities of intergovernmental organizations is monitored and controlled. And so to imagine that we can engage in free, intergovernmental exchanges with Iran, well, that will take time. But then we are also talking about proxies or so-called proxies or agencies that Iran uses through non-state actors to influence the Persian Gulf region and the region. For example, groups that it works with in Iraq or in Syria or in Bahrain, the Shias, etc. There's a concept in IR called paradiplomacy. If you ask Iran why are you not working with state actors? Why are you destabilizing the region? Why are you working with all these non-state actors? Why are you even arming them? They'll say, well, first of all, hang on. I am spreading democracy because these are underrepresented groups that have been ignored. And so I am empowering them. And it's time that somebody listen to them. And if you're not going to listen to them as a state actor, then you can listen to them through paradiplomacy. These are non-state actors that can influence foreign policy. Therefore, they need to be at the diplomatic negotiating table. For example, in Yemen with the Houthis, in Iraq with Shia groups in Iran. So I hope that so it's a complicated affair in the United States because we are here in America. This is something that I think and I hope that we come to terms with sooner than later, and we are gradually heading there, that we cannot ignore these paramilitary actors. We cannot ignore these other groups. We need to give them a diplomatic role because they will shape the future of the region to a very, very fair extent.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So time is winding down, but we'll go to Henry Ancona, another World Boston board member. Henry, are you ready to roll?
Hi there. I don't know what just happened to my system. Thank you. A terrific presentation. I'd like you to comment a little bit on the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran in particular, particularly over the whole oil situation. On the one hand, the proxy war in Yemen, the moves towards seeming more cooperation between the two, whereas in fact, I don't know really what the whole situation really means. Why are they getting closer when while at the same time they're fighting in Yemen and can't seem to stop that one? So could you comment on the Saudi-Iran situation and help us understand what's going on there?
Absolutely, a pleasure. Well, part of the reason they are talking right now is because the Biden administration is encouraging it, because somehow the Biden administration wants to signal to Iran that it can look at a better region and a better engagement with the region if it works with the United States. And therefore bringing Saudi Arabia on board helps. They've been having talks for 6 months now. And some of the things they can resolve, some things they cannot, like Yemen, is not easily resolvable because Saudi Arabia just doesn't want to deal with the kind of actors that Iran is dealing with in the format that Iran wants them to, give full power, for example, to the Houthis. But I want to talk more about the dynamics of the Saudi-Iranian relationship. What is happening is great. It's great when people talk. It's great when the US administration comes in power and says, everybody talk to one another. But fundamentally, the reason why Saudi Arabia and Iran don't often talk is because of those power imbalances that I mentioned in my presentation. When there's power imbalance, the region, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, lose their ability bit by bit to engage with one another like normal actors do, like normal neighbors do, because they have to spend a lot of money and a lot of energy trying to figure out those power imbalances, trying to ensure their security when there are power imbalances, say, invest in the war in Yemen, invest in the conflict in Syria. That takes away from their national power. It makes them weaker, not stronger. So while they are talking, that is just cosmetic. And even if they come to an agreement, it will not stand the test of time unless and until the United States considerably invests in restoring that power imbalance between them and within the Persian Gulf region, from administration to administration. It doesn't matter whether President Biden is in office or President Trump is in office or whoever wants to come to office in Washington. There has to be a sustained commitment. Otherwise, the power abilities of Saudi Arabia and Iran will slowly crumble no matter how much trade they do, which is great, how much money they have, which is great. Eventually, that pot is going to dry up. And so restoring the power imbalance is a very tall order. And I would just suggest humbly that we observe the discussions between Saudi Arabia and Iran within that light and see how far it goes. Hopefully there will be some tangible results on all fronts, including with the JCPOA.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, we're ending on an easy question. Saudi and Iran, explain. I am afraid we're running out of time. I have many more questions, and I see we still have more that unfortunately we're not able to get to. I, for one, am going to watch this over again when we post it, because what a terrific, I think they say, stay tour d'horizon you've given us. We're really grateful, Banafsheh, that you've been here with us tonight.
It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so very much. And thank you for all the brilliant questions.
Well, come back and see us in person. And audience, thank you for your attendance and thoughtful questions. So we hope that we see you back here on December 14th for our last Great Decisions and last event of the year with Professor Willie Shih, just in time for Christmas shopping or holiday shopping or any kind of shopping. We're going to be talking about supply chains. So until then, thanks again, everybody, and have a great evening.